I was adopted into a white family as an infant. My origins reside in Treaty 6, Siksika and Blackfoot territory. With my short time in Airdrie, Alberta, I was spoiled. I had attentive, caring parents, and I had amazing siblings who would willingly play Bratz dolls with me. With that being said, as you grow older, these things can change. And that's especially true when my parents took the very bold choice to move to Manitoba, a place that they were very familiar with, which I was not. We moved to a small town 4 hours out west by Winnipeg, a town that was too small to even be considered a town in the first place. Right away, you notice things like how the town is all white. There is a huge lack of diversity in that place. The culture was very flat. It was all around farming and sports, especially hockey. It was very restrictive in the sense that if you did not fit into the typical social dynamic that they were looking for, you would be looked down upon, talked about, or even worse, at times you could be outcasted. Of course, this was a problem for me, as I did not abide by the typical rules that they followed, but more about that later. Unfortunately, the town tended to hold on to traditional values like gender values. If there was a boy who did not want to play a sport, and that was public information, they would come to 3 conclusions. 1, you're lazy. 2, you have something against them. And number 3, you are not manly enough to play a sport like hockey. If you're a woman who was taking liberty in your personal style choices, 3 more conclusions would come up as well. 1, you're not ladylike enough. Number 2, you're lazy. Or on the opposite spectrum, you're trying too hard. Of course, these restrictions were a very big problem for me growing up, as we would find out. I tended to have a very different attitude towards things the typical boy my age would have liked. I was not into sports. In fact, I was strictly against it, as even as a kid, I had a lot of anxiety. I did not like roughhousing. I did not like using very insensitive terms towards others. I did not enjoy anything like snowmobiling or dirt biking at a very early age, which I'm trying to comprehend how they were even able to do that. Either way, I was terrified. All childish, but harmless things. Of course, for me, on the opposite spectrum, I like things like gymnastics. Secretly, my colors that I loved were purple and pink. Unfortunately, due to my sister, I had a very big love for One Direction after it being shoved down my throat. And most of all, once again, I was not somebody who enjoyed sports at all, and all of my friends were girls as well. And people took notice to this. It started off with childish insults like, "You need to man up," or "You act like a girl." Of course, childish. It had lots of meaning for me as a young, sensitive kid. It was just seen as teasing, and it was excused, not being able to identify the fact that it was actual bullying. Of course, as I got older, things gradually would become more vile. At grade 4 and 5, even before the words were fully being used at me, I heard boys in the hallway calling each other gay, using the F slur loud and clear, but once again, it being ignored and excused. There were times in my middle years where they would use these derogatory terms towards me. Sometimes I would be walking by a group of boys who could be in grade 10, 11, or even 12, and I would hear some sort of sly comment about my identity. Unfortunately, this was a normal day-to-day life for me. Whenever I had tried to complain to the teachers about it or to the staff, it was just shrugged off as teasing, and I was often told, "Oh, they're just boys being boys. Don't listen to them. It's just a game. Oh, they'll grow out of it. They're just boys after all. Boys will be boys. Don't pay any attention to them." Of course, it didn't help that whenever I tried to defend myself, oftentimes I was called a crybaby of some sorts. It didn't help either that I was incredibly terrified of the world, so those things I tended to keep to myself and did not tell my parents about. Of course, at the age of 11 years old, I was now questioning the world around me in very serious ways. I now gain this idea, this incomplete story of what a boy my age should act like. From what I saw, a boy my age should be aggressive. It's okay for them to use rough words, rough terms towards each other. They roughhouse. They like sports, and they only consume media around sports. They're unemotional, and they're big and strong. On the other hand, it seemed that women were not strong enough by themselves. If they were to play any sports like baseball, it was not actually called a sport. According to the boys, it was called softball, which is not a real sport at all. Of course, many of the times that I would try to stand up for myself, to no prevail, I was ignored. It did not help with the fact that there was older adults that were around me in my close circle who were actually perpetuating this behavior around me, often saying ignorant things like, "You should go make me a sandwich," as a joke, or even just joking about something as simple as a young boy wearing pink. Disgustingly, these standards would develop way further, especially leading on the edge of high school. At 13, 14, and 15 years old, I heard boys in my classroom talking about girls in our classroom in disgusting, awful ways, talking about their bodies, using terms like slut and whore towards them. Despite the fact that they were 13 to 15 years old and not actually ever being able to really experience life, to know what those mature words actually meant. Unfortunately, their homophobic, their sexist, bully-like, and judgmental behavior was commonly excused. Unfortunately, because of that, it was like that they ran the school. It was a man's world there. They could bully and tease you. But once again, it would be ignored. It would just be seen as fun, young man banter. Of course, that is not what it felt like to me. However, because of how scared I was of the world, there were times where I would try and conform to these standards. Even as a young kid, I was actually trying to involve myself in the church, which I now look back on and I regret it a lot. Unfortunately for me, things did not get better. It was easy to see that these people could not change. These people were nearly incapable of change. Now, of course, that sounds pretty rough to say at first hand. But these were kids that were being taught these things by their parents, casually hearing awful things that their parents have said, and now taking it to heart and forcing these toxic standards onto others like me. I became bitter, I became angry, and I was tired that I lived in a small town that was so suppressive with who I wanted to be. Anyone who was different was outcasted and bullied, and so maliciously, but teachers ignored it and turned away from it. Unfortunately, because of this, I gained the reputation for being quite snappy and rude. Of course, with that did not help me out very much. And finally, with that, I began realizing that they were not going to change. The system was holding up to it, so it was me. I changed. Around 13 and 12 years old, I was there figuring out my identity, questioning my sexuality as a young boy. By 13 years old, I was finally able to figure it out. But of course, the world was terrifying, and there I was hiding it for a little while. That was until the age of 14, when I met a boy that I was head over heels in love with, who was a dancer, and I wanted to tell people about it. I deserved to share that with the world because I was actually happy. So I shared it with my sisters. I told my dad, and of course, you know how older folks can be. We now have a teamwork relationship now, which is awesome. I told people around my school, and of course, it was mostly support only from the girls. Many of the boys were very uncomfortable being in the same room as me. It was like if I touched them, they would catch some sort of plague. In my mind at the time, just to try and make myself feel better, I thought that maybe it's because they were worried I was going to fall in love with them and fall into their arms like some sort of damsel in distress, despite the fact that that was my worst nightmare in that small town. Of course, it was not just me figuring out that I was gay. It was a very restrictive and prohibitive time for me, because there was like a constant barrier of fear no matter where I went. I liked the idea of having long, gorgeous hair. I wanted to wear a beautiful red dress on my grad night. I watched videos for hours on end about people like Nikki Tutorials, Jackie Aina, Nima Tang, just watching how they applied their makeup and wishing that I could do that on myself. But once again, I was being held back because of the fear of judgment that I was already facing and that I would have faced if I were to do that. But I noticed how the system benefited them. The system upheld them, but it was very easy to fall out of that system, that oppressive system that benefited them and not me. Once I began to realize this, I knew that there was nothing for me to uphold. I was already an outcast in the first place, so why should I continue with this anymore? And then, there it was. I let the river lead me on. The system was now in shambles, and I saw way past it. My friend at the time, who was very supportive of who I was, had caught wind of the fact that I was very much interested in makeup. She gave me a small, limited supplies from the drugstore, and there I was, 3 a.m. on some nights, 10 p.m. on school nights, just practicing these techniques on myself, finally being happy that I was able to feel safe with figuring out my identity. Of course, putting it on for the first time, I felt absolutely beautiful. I felt like I had seen this person that I've never met before, despite the fact that I've known them for all of my life. Of course, the makeup looked absolutely awful, and I'm sure my family members can attest to that. Of course, I wanted to make this my norm. This was not something that I could just sit in my room and do for hours at a time. This was me. This is who I was as a human being. And that was a scary concept. Though at the time, I did not realize that. When I was still figuring out my identity, I actually was wondering if I was trans. Of course, I now know that that is not the case, as later on in my life, I discovered that my identity is a two-spirited individual who identifies as a boy and a girl, and I'm sure both those spirits are what's keeping me strong here tonight. The first day that I showed up to school with makeup on, it was quite a shock to the system. People were shocked to see that a boy was wearing makeup in such a small town that fit the typical norms that they were all used to. Shocked to see somebody was taking their own path, a path that they've never seen before. Some supported me, some didn't, and luckily those that didn't support me, I'm sure that their judgmental feelings got in the way of noticing how awful my makeup actually looked. Of course, and then it goes on from there. Though that was scary, and though that was discouraging to see the fact that I was not going to be accepted for who I was, I realized there was no point of letting it hold me back. With my newfound identity later on in life, I would start accumulating questions about the gender dynamics that we are so affected by in our society. I saw how gender dynamics, stereotypes, and standards affected women, how it caused awful pressure to look the most important, beautiful that they've ever had to look. I saw how it affected me, how for a long time I feared being myself. I feared just being able to walk outside with lip gloss on. But of course, with that, I had to decide whether or not that was going to change, and that definitely, thankfully, did. So I finally put my project idea together. Of course, it did not come right away, but in grade 12, a year where I'd finally thrive in my new identity, I came up with the idea, Project Boys Will Be Boys, the name based off of a saying that I heard very commonly growing up. This project, the purpose of it was to be able to dissect the very peculiar and just overall strange, oppressive world of what a gender dynamic is in our society. I sat down with a diverse demographic of men. I asked them questions like, in your terms, how would you define masculinity? Or what are some messages that you received about boyhood growing up? There was also personal questions like, what male role models do you know of? Or what's stopping you back from actually being able to lean in this new creative expression of femininity? Of course, it was a very interesting experience. I was there creating an experience that I could share with all of you, an experience that had stories, real-life experiences that could share a new perspective. With the first interview that I ever did, I asked the question, what messages did you receive about boyhood? He paused for a second, he stopped, and then he looked at me and pointed and said, that we're taught to not be like you. Of course, with that, it was a non-malicious comment. But even if it was, I probably would have been used to it by that point. In the same experience, there were times where I was doing his makeup, and whenever people would walk in, he would become noticeably anxious. Many times he couldn't focus on the questions in real time, and oftentimes he would shout out things like, "Oh, this is just a project, don't worry," holding up his hand to cover his face. Of course, this did not surprise me. It did not surprise me that he was not able to lean into this proper and new experience. The fear of judgment is strong, something that I've felt long before him. I remember another instance that was the exact opposite, where I had sat down with a boy who had a very diverse background, who, when he was walking out with his makeup on, he was strutting down that hallway excited to go and show his friends. Of course, there was a clear difference between those who grew up in a linear traditional household compared to those who grew up in a diverse background like he did. His answers often were things that he wished he saw in our society, things that he wished society was like, compared to those who were talking about their fears of being judged over and over again by friends and family just for doing something unique and new. And I quote, "If my friends and family saw me wearing makeup with no context, they would sit there, they would judge me, they would make fun of me, and they'd question my identity and sexuality." Something no person definitely should have to go through. Of course, with this project, we see in not so obvious ways at first how this can affect an individual. The concept of a single, incomplete story comes into mind. Oftentimes, we are not shown the full story of an individual who has actual life experiences, new experiences that, if shared, can teach us a new perspective and teach us possibly a new way of life. However, with the restrictions that we have to deal with in our society that expects us to be normal in some way, many of us are not able to express our creative individuality. Of course, many other things started coming to the surface as well that I've never thought about. A close friend of mine, who is also my boss at Main Street Project, Karen Merson, who has a master's degree in gender studies, had noted a very interesting observation. When telling these stories, there seemed to be a very basic, low-level understanding of what it meant to be called gay, what it meant to call others gay. Though they may be in a cis and very privileged experience where they don't often have to experience this type of oppression, there was a clear understanding of what it meant to be in that toxic masculine standard compared to being an outsider. There was an outside versus in. The outside where you could be judged, where whatever you did, every moment was watched, and you would be seen as an outcast, compared to the inside where you were safe, you could conform, and be safe away from being judged. In our social hierarchy, we know that it's important to stay on top at all times, no matter what we do. Whether that is fitting into the typical norms that I've been talking about, or fitting in with a popular group just to gain a higher social status. With all of these, when you do that, you are seen with respect, and people develop great opinions about you, something that, of course, feels nice. I had spoken to a gentleman who was in university football, a football team that was full of all grown, capable men, yet he talked about his experiences in the football locker room, where it was a fairly disrespectful place towards women, often noting how they talked about a woman's physical attributes rather than her emotional being. I heard other instances, like how there was a big focus on the game. He had injured himself. He injured his finger, but he was told to tape it up and man up. It seemed that there was a very common belief that any human emotions like empathy, looking out for a friend, would hold you back from doing what you need to do. It is feminine and weak. When I had spoken to renowned sex therapist, Dr. Reese Malone, he had brought up an interesting point that I don't know if I was exactly ready to hear at the time. We see how this affects men and creates toxic masculine standards, and we saw how it affected me as an individual where I feared being myself. But one thing that I did not think about was just how much it actually affected my thinking. When I had spoken to him about the interviews and had showed him examples, after this, he had noted how there was an interesting confirmation bias that I seemed to be holding with this whole interview. I was talking about and interpreting the interviews in very specific ways that led to the belief that I had opinions and decided thoughts about these interviews before these interviews even had happened. Of course, something I probably did not want to hear at the time. It was eye-opening, and it made me really look at myself and see just how much social expectations have a hold on us as a whole. Though frustrating, complex, scary, hard to deal with, we need to understand on a human level that this is just the actions based off of what we've had to deal with. Hidden actions that we haven't seen, like a father who grew up in the 80s, hearing these standards over and over again, now perpetuating these standards onto his young son. His young son takes these to heart, and then he perpetuates these on others. He perpetuates these on his young little cousins. He calls people mean names in sports. On the other hand, it can affect in very harmful ways, like isolation. For a long time, of course, I feared being able to express myself, expressing my identity, but I also feared expressing my emotions. I was scared of being judged, that if they ever had caught wind of what these emotions were, they would somehow think different of me, think that I'm crazy, that I'm weird. And of course, that really did hold me back for a long time, and it made me express my anger in not so healthy ways. When we dig these ideas up to the surface, we have to understand that there is an individual there who is human and yearns to be seen with depth, care, patience, and actual understanding. Even after all of their actions, they're still human, and the reason that they committed these actions is probably because of an individual before them that had forced these standards on them. Though it's hard to empathize with at times, we need to understand why this problem had started in the first place. With that, I hope that puts some new ideas into your head, and thank you for coming to my TED Talk.